After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Australia's War Cabinet asked the Chiefs of Staff to assess Japan's plans. They considered that Japan might attack Australia directly from aircraft carriers or gradually conquer Singapore and the Netherlands East Indies before invading. Japan could also target strategic bases such as Rabaul, Port Moresby, or seize Darwin. These possibilities raise serious concerns given Australia's limited resources. This is the story of the fall of Rabaul, the important yet poorly defended base in New Britain. In December, the Australian War Cabinet decided to pause the Empire Air Training Scheme's overseas deployment, which had been $620 per month. Australia urgently needed aircrew for local roles, and with the Japanese Navy posing a threat, sending personnel abroad had become too risky. As a result, Australian aircraft, particularly Hudsons at Rabaul and Catalinas at Port Moresby, prioritised locating Japanese vessels. In December 1941, the Catalinas from 11 and 20 squadrons carried out over 100 reconnaissance and search missions, covering regions such as New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, the Solomons, and New Ireland. Situated on Simpson Harbour in northeastern New Britain, Rabaul is surrounded on three sides by volcanic craters. Although there were good local roads, none connected Rabaul to the rest of the mountainous, jungle-covered island and were unsuitable for motor traffic. The main basic airstrip, Vunakanau, was about 16 kilometres south of Rabaul and had a single runway cut through the kunai grass. In early December, No. 24 Squadron's limited number of Hudsons and Wirraways were deployed to the outpost.
24 Squadron was based at Garbutt in Townsville, and when the Japanese invasion was imminent after they entered the war in December 41, the squadron was sent to Rabaul. And I can assure you, we went up, and I went up with Jimmy Isles. We ferried Wirraway to Yeowart, and then they went on. We came back, fortunately, to Archerfield. And of course the Japs invaded, and well, I think the whole thing was over in 5 minutes, wasn't it? And I lost again some good friends, but a lot of them got out. And it was a terrible thing that a government would use a training aeroplane as their first line of defence here in Australia. Well, that's what happened.
There were no dispersal bays or protective revetments to conceal the aircraft. Therefore, whenever enemy reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead to gauge RAAF strength, the Australian planes were easily visible, lined up on the strip. A corrugated iron shelter served as both a workshop and a hangar, but lacked storage or living facilities. Refuelling was done manually, and repair tools were absent or completely inadequate. The squadron was also operating with a minimal staff, consisting of just 115 out of the 650 men it had in Townsville. The 1,400-strong Australian garrison stood as a barrier against the Japanese effort to establish Rabaul as a major base.
They told us that we were there to guard the airfields and just to show our strength more than anything. That's all it was. And we thought, oh, well, we'll be here for a few months and then we'll move on. But the months just went on, and a lot of the boys, including myself, started to get pretty frustrated because it was a pretty mundane sort of life. A garrison, if you can imagine a garrison, there's not much to do in a place like Rabaul. They had a theatre there, which you could go to, and they had 3 levels of seating. The whites sat upstairs, and the coloured population and Chinese, they sat at the back stalls and the natives sat in the front stalls. and that's how it had been for years, and that's the way it was run. But there's not much else to do up there. We had very little training as far as firing guns or anything, because we didn't have the ammunition. You used to go out and pretend you were firing, but they didn't have the ammunition to have, real practice. So we went out, they gave us no jungle training, none at all. Apparently, I found out afterwards, it was offered by some of the patrol officers that were there that knew the jungle, knew what it could do to you, and they could have taught us what we could eat and what we couldn't eat out in the jungle. And apparently we found out afterwards there's lots of things that you could eat, but we didn't know about because nobody told us. So they put us there and virtually left us there as a garrison battalion, and that was it. So we finished up with a force of about 1,400 altogether, and out of that the 22nd Battalion was about 930, somewhere around that figure approximately, 930 fellows.
On December 8th, Japanese reconnaissance planes flew over Rabaul. Australian Hudsons also conducted reconnaissance missions, while surveilling Kapinga Marangi Island, about 500 kilometres north of Rabaul in the Caroline Islands. A Hudson crew observed slipways, barges and other small vessels. They also saw a merchant ship speeding north and firing at the aircraft. Squadron Leader John Lerew of No. 24 Squadron arrived at Rabaul with his Wirraways to reinforce the outpost. In a somewhat unfair critique of the squadron operating under extremely tough conditions, Wing Commander Bill Gowring called the bombing effort lamentable and criticised the crew that failed to take useful photographs during the sortie that spotted the ship. Lerew was much more understanding, having first-hand experience of the tough conditions faced by his men. Gowring concluded his message with, "The Empire expects much of a few." Lerew was not hesitant to respond in kind, replying, "The Empire expects much, repeat much, of a few." In response to another criticism about not keeping headquarters fully informed about his situation, he cheekily said, "Disappointment in lack of assistance rendered by Almighty." On a different occasion, he noted that more concern was coming from the south than from the enemy in the north. On December 18th, 2 Japanese Mavises flew over Rabaul on reconnaissance. 4 Wirraways attempted to intercept, but did not have the speed. Command at Townsville then ordered a single Hudson reconnaissance aircraft to proceed to Kapinga Marangi, another small island to the north, and issued a warning that a Japanese aircraft carrier might be present in the area. Anticipating possible opposition against the Hudson, Lerew decided to undertake the sortie himself, marking his first operational mission. 3 hours in, the crew saw the island 10,000 feet below and began circling to take photographs. They came under flak and were attacked by an E-13A1 Jake seaplane. Lerew opened fire with his nose guns and quickly broke off contact. By Christmas, 2 similar reconnaissance flights had taken place. Although they caused no damage, the photographs from these flights led to the creation of the first RAAF target map. On New Year's Day 1942, Lerew commanded 4 Hudsons in a raid on Kapinga Marangi, hitting oil and bomb storage facilities, barracks, a lookout tower, and several aircraft. The fire was still burning when 3 Hudsons, including Lerew's, returned on January 3rd, causing additional, though limited, damage. On January 4th, 1942, Rabaul was struck by its first Japanese air raid.
There were coast watchers, and they were phoning through to Rabaul that there were planes on their way, and an air raid siren was sounded in the township. And once that go, well, we immediately took our positions on the guns and just waited to see what planes were involved. And there was an air of excitement and nervousness naturally once the air raid siren went. because we didn't know what was going to happen. You're talking about the 4th of January now. So we just stood ready to do what we'd been training to do since we joined. And when we saw the arrowhead coming towards us and the first order was shouted up, fuse 29, up 3.5, right 4, it was done automatically. In went the shell, down came the firing handle, up went the shells. And we had to wait and see then the cotton wool puffs which they provide in this clear blue sky. And they were well below the target in the general direction, but well below the target. But because they were 3-inch guns and not 3.7, their maximum fuse was 3.0, which would probably be about 16,000 feet. We didn't know exactly how high they were, but I'd say they were probably about 16, maybe 17,000 feet. They would have known what we had anyway. I mean, there was that much fifth column going on. I mean, with all these German missionaries, they probably knew, the Japs probably knew more about our equipment than we did, or as much. And as I say, apart from an area of excitement and anticipation, look, I know it was a bit nerve-wracking until they passed overhead.
16 Nels approached the Lacunae airfield, while 2 outdated Australian anti-aircraft guns attempted, unsuccessfully, to shoot them down. The altitude of the bombers protected them, but also reduced their accuracy. Out of over 60 bombs dropped, only 3 hit the airstrip. The attack killed 15 local labourers and injured many, leading to the loss of the RAAF's local workforce. 2 Wirraways managed to take off, but they couldn't climb quickly enough to intercept the Nels. Squadron Leader Arch Tyndall, an armaments officer from Northern Area Headquarters who was visiting Rabaul for inspection, piloted one of them. Later that day, 8 Mavis flying boats launched an attack, but all 90 bombs missed the Vunakanau airfield.
It didn't worry us much because they missed. The bomb the aerodrome, but they didn't hit it. There was actually a Hudson airplane, mail plane landed below Boeing. And he didn't know there was any bombs coming. He hurried off the deck, didn't stand on the ground long, he took off pretty quick. But the air raids got more often, more people, more planes.
RAAF headquarters organised a reconnaissance mission to Truk, a Japanese base about 1,000 kilometres north of New Britain. Number 6 Squadron from Richmond, New South Wales, was assigned this task, flying 2 specially modified Hudsons with extra fuel tanks and 2 advanced 20-inch cameras. Pilots Bob Yeowart and Bob Green were briefed over 4 days and understood they would likely need to fight their way through enemy Zero fighters at Truk. The 2 Hudsons arrived at Rabaul on the 6th of January. Green's plane experienced engine problems that couldn't be repaired there, so Yeowart had to complete the mission alone. Lerew, flying his Wirraway, accompanied Yeowart as they flew the Hudson to New Ireland for better protection from Japanese air raids. Once there, at Kavieng airstrip, the Hudson was camouflaged with pawpaw branches. Lerew followed up his flight to Kavieng with another attack on Kapinga Marangi. In return, 9 Mavis flying boats attacked Vunakanau, destroying a nearly complete direction-finding station and a control hut, damaging the runway and a grounded Wirraway. A 4th Japanese raid struck Rabaul on the 7th of January, with about 20 Nels destroying 3 aircraft and damaging buildings and other planes. Anderson, Lerew, and Flight Lieutenant Peter Turnbull attempted to save a burning Wirraway, while a blazing Hudson just 50 metres away exploded, igniting bombs and petrol drums nearby. The airmen took cover under the squadron doctor's car, which had just arrived. Despite the limited space, they survived the shower of aircraft debris and bomb fragments that struck the car from above.
Well, we could see we could hear what was going on. They were over the airports. The first lot of bombs were dropped on the airport. They killed about half a dozen natives the first time, put a few potholes in the drone, and that was about it. The next time they came over, they did the other drome. There was 2 aerodromes there. They did the same thing at the other drome and dropped a few bombs around, but again never came near the camp, and the camp was visible because you can imagine, 1,000 men living in a camp all in huts, and they're all lined up, so it was easy to see, and they knew where we were, and as proved afterwards when they landed. But that was it mainly. They'd drop a few, and the most of the first lot that came over would have been anything from about 6 to a dozen planes, always high-flying bombers, always, until the big raid that happened there a couple of days before they landed.
Early on January 9th, Yeowart and his crew took off for Truk, aiming to arrive shortly after 10 a.m. At 13,000 feet, with engines desynchronized to sound like a Japanese bomber, they captured images of flying boats, 12 warships, and newly built structures. An airstrip cut through a hill was crowded with Japanese bombers. During their first pass, anti-aircraft fire erupted at the Hudson, and enemy fighters began climbing towards them. Yeowart proceeded with a second pass to complete all assigned tasks for both Hudsons. As the 25-minute flight ended, Yeowart dove into an electrical storm to avoid pursuing fighters and anti-aircraft fire. He eventually brought the Hudson to 500 feet, losing his pursuers, and returned to Kavieng. Yeowart landed with just enough fuel, a wingtip shot off, and most importantly, 280 reels of photographs. Once in Townsville, the films were quickly developed in a darkroom, producing excellent images. Catalinas were tasked with conducting reconnaissance and raids on targets identified in photographs at Truk. However, bad weather hampered these missions. Nonetheless, a single aircraft, piloted by 23-year-old regular Air Force officer Ernest Beaumont, successfully reached Truk. When a brief gap in the clouds occurred, he carried out 2 runs and dropped 16 bombs, killing 5 and injuring others on 3 ships. On January 17th, while Lerew was inspecting a new dispersal bay at Kavieng, a lone Mavis attacked the strip. Lerew quickly jumped into his Wirraway, taking off without a shirt, helmet, goggles, or harness. At 16,000 feet, he looked down and saw the flying boat below him at 8,000 feet. He tracked the Mavis and about 100 kilometers from Kavieng launched a head-on attack. He fired at close range, hitting the aircraft, damaging it, and killing 2 crew members, but the enemy continued flying. On the afternoon of January 20th, the Rabaul anti-aircraft battery spotted Zeros heading in. Just before 1 p.m., 109 Japanese aircraft were heading towards Rabaul. Carrier planes launched from the Shokaku and Zuikaku. These were veterans of Pearl Harbor and China, and now the best Japanese pilots in the Pacific Theater.
You'd see one formation, and then you'd look around and see another formation, and then you'd see that the planes were different. There were small ones, there were Zeros, there were dive bombers, and there were heavy bombers. And it just went on from there. And we were so busy. I mean, first of all, we'd fire, the command post would give us directions on which formation to fire at, and then this one, and then, of course, the dive bombers started coming in. They came in on the Herstein, and then the Zeros. Then the Zeros appeared, and that's when the Wirraways appeared. And our Wirraways were still climbing to meet the Zeros when the Zeros just went down and shot them out of the sky. 5 of them. There were 6 left by the 20th of January. The 6th one was piloted by Flight Lieutenant Anderson and pilot and flying officer Cole Butterworth, who I spoke to yesterday. And the reason they didn't get shot out of the sky was because their Pratt & Whitney motor quit when they were 500 feet off the ground, and they crashed into the trees and both finished up in hospital and were evacuated. That's the only reason Cole Butterworth is alive today, that his Wirraway quit and they just crashed into the trees.
An airborne patrol of 2 Wirraways met the intruders. John Lowe and Clive Ashford took on 6 Zeros, until 3 got behind their Wirraway, sending it flaming into the sea, killing both Lowe and Ashford. George Herring and Bert Clare, in the second Wirraway, soon had 3 Zeros on their tail. Pilot and gunner both sustained leg wounds, and the Wirraway's tail was shredded, but Herring somehow pulled it out of a spin and crash-landed at Lakunai. Meanwhile, the Wirraway crews that had been on the ground had now climbed towards the Japanese aircraft. However, the air battle lasted only 7 minutes, leaving no Australian aircraft in the sky. Lerew reported 5 Wirraways destroyed, 3 shot down, 1 destroyed during takeoff, and another damaged by strafing. 2 others that crash-landed were seriously damaged. 6 airmen were killed, and 5 injured. They did not score any confirmed kills, although Japanese records indicate anti-aircraft gunners achieved a few successes.
They were training planes, that's all they were ever designated for, but they sent them up there as fighter planes. And of course when the early bombing raids come on, where there was bombers only, well, it was useless because they couldn't go up that high. These planes had no way of getting up to the bombers. But the day of the big raid, they had warnings about that, so the Wirraways took off. I think I don't know the exact number, but around about 6 of them got airborne, and we were on the ground watching, and the planes came over, the bombers came over first, and then the fighter planes, the Japanese fighter planes came over, and we could hear the firing, and it was distinctive because the Wirraways had machine guns on, and you could hear the rattle, 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 and the Zeros had cannons, and you could hear the poof, 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 you know. And within about 5 minutes, the Zeros were all shot down. The Wirraways were all shot down. I think 1 landed. One got down safely. The others, some of the crew got down. But basically that was the end of the RAAF. The Hudson had already taken out the Air Force fellas, because they had the Air Force fellas there with no planes to fly, so they reckon they were pretty valuable, the fellas that could fly planes, so they got them out and they took them back to Moresby. So when the Japanese landed there, we had no Navy, there was no Navy, no Air Force.
Squadron Leader Lerew now had only 2 Wirraways and 1 Hudson. He signalled to headquarters his plan to send the Hudson with casualties to Port Moresby. He also informed them that the Wirraways were ineffective for defence and repeated his request, "Will you now please send some fighters?" The response, which finally showed some sympathy, was, "Regret inability to supply fighters. If we had them, you would get them." By late afternoon the next day, the invasion fleet was near. Lerew was ordered to send all available aircraft against the fleet, but he only had 1 suitable Hudson. Local helpers pulled it out of the trees and through a swamp. Though it became airborne, night fell before the crew could find their target. On the morning of 21st January, Lerew attended the burial of 2 aircrew members at Rabaul Cemetery, officiated by Chaplain John May of the 2nd 22nd Battalion. Afterwards, in Lerew's headquarters, he, May, and the 24th Squadron Intelligence Officer, Jeff Lempriere, shared feelings of bitterness over the inadequate support from Australian authorities. Inspired by the Gladiators' salute, May and Lerew decided to send a signal to Northern Area headquarters reading, "Morituri vos salutamus. We who are about to die salute you." However, Lerew and most of his men would not die in Rabaul, but the soldiers there would be far less fortunate. Subsequently, headquarters ordered Lerew to Port Moresby to command a new Hudson squadron. He assigned the only available Hudson to evacuate the wounded first, and that night it took off from Vunakanau, fully loaded and guided by a few faint lights. On 22nd January, as the Japanese armada approached Rabaul, Lerew assembled his men to evacuate, while the army fought it out as best they could.
Air raid alarm sounded, and we naturally expected we'd be in action. And we saw them coming in from the from the northeast. But they kept well out of our range, and they just went straight to Parade Point, circled over it, and broke off in singles and just went in and bombed the hell out of it. Mostly dive bombers. There were blokes buried in slit trenches there. They blew the guns off there, blew the guns to pieces. And we could just couldn't do a thing. We just stood by and watched it. They didn't even come anywhere near us when they'd finished. They just circled to the southeast and off they went. Yep. And then that afternoon, we saw them out on the horizon through the gun scopes, telescopes. Selby rang up headquarters and they sent 2 officers up and they had a look, and all they did was say, stand by. They went back and they just said, you just stand by. And the next thing we heard was there was a terrific explosion down near the waterfront where the engineers had set off a ammunition dump down there. And then came the orders about 4 o'clock to destroy our guns, which was a shock and a surprise, which we did. And the ringside telescope was draped over the barrel of number 2 gun, and you put a shell down the breech, down the muzzle, and one in the breech, and just pull the firing, and then the barrels of the gun spread out like radishes, not radishes, celery. You know how you cut celery? Just splayed ahead like that. The ringside telescope, that disappeared, and we were down below ground level on the northern side of the ridge, and metal was flying above. It only lasted a few seconds, and then it was all over.
In a convoy of trucks and cars, the airmen headed along the south coast. During a difficult mission, the group had to abandon their trucks at the Wirraway River, but RAAF flying boats rescued about 120 airmen over several nights.
The operations of Townsville sent up 2 Sunderland flying boats. They were seconded to the RAAF. They were with ex-Qantas pilots. One was Lenny Gray, who was a radio ham as well, and he got an Air Force Cross for that. So he went up, the first one. Walters was the other one. I think it was Walters or Waters. And he was in the second one. And Lenny Gray landed there, or touched down there, and brought out the first contingent down to Samurai. Samurai was a very pretty spot, but a lot of cross currents there. It was very difficult to put a flying boat down and up. And we waited there, and we picked them up there, took them to, our CO was the captain, a chap called Cohen. He changed his name later on to Kingsland. And we went on that leg from Samurai to Port Morituri, and we stayed there a couple of days doing this, you see, shuttle service there. And they had to walk several miles to get this rendezvous down from Rabaul to be picked up in secret, dead of night, by the Sunderland flying boats, Qantas planes. They were seconded to us. And we had an easier job going from Samurai to Port Moresby with them.
On January 23rd, the Japanese invasion force landed and after a short fight took Rabaul, eventually turning New Britain into a formidable base. Recapturing Rabaul would be the primary Allied objective in the Southwest Pacific for the next 2 years. Thanks for watching. Our videos are researched, written and produced by a small team of filmmakers dedicated to bringing you accurate military aviation history from around the world. Please consider supporting us by joining our merch and members site for early access, bonus content and merch discounts. or become a YouTube channel member for early access, or simply hit subscribe. Your support means everything.